has had a dramatic effect. So this is the city that came back. So starting roughly around 2005, 2006, the city began really to actively work on this agenda. They put together a sustainability plan, which is really where IBM has intersected with them. But they also put a huge emphasis on developing thinking around these principles. And so 2010, it was acknowledged as it says here, one of the 10 smartest cities on the planet, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. It was also voted the #1 most livable small city in the United States by the US Council of Mayors a couple of years ago as well. So here's a city that really did, in a lot of ways, come back from a near-death experience. It did it by defining a set of goals and then looking for partners who could help them realize those goals. When we first started talking there, which is about 3 years ago now, they were very declining population. One of those is water treatment, and they're very concerned. So can we help them find leaks? I'll show you how we've gone after that. They were very concerned about public transportation. They were afraid that young people were not able to afford to live directly in the center of the city and were living in the somewhat cheaper suburbs, but there wasn't an adequate transportation system to bring people into the center of the city. So how could you improve transportation? All of this, of course, without spending any money or any significant amount of money. And what we have done together is to tin cup their ambitions around many, many different agencies and piece together the budget that will enable them to realize some of these ideas. So here's one example on the bus system that we helped them to develop here, which is, given a constrained amount of transportation capacity, what is the optimum set of routes that you should be running in order to meet the needs of the passengers? And they weren't going to buy any new buses, and ideally you would use fewer buses because that reduces operating cost. You had to do this within the constraints of the road system as it existed and where people are living. And what we looked at through the kinds of instrumented, interconnected intelligence that I mentioned earlier on is where should you put that capacity? And by the way, that capacity changes through the day. So these are somewhat adaptive routes that have been implemented here. Now this was a fascinating piece of work that other cities have now asked us if we can replicate. We've done a similar one last year in Helsinki. It's a great example of saving money. This pulled something like 25% of the operating cost out of their transit system just by using information. That is, in a sense, the power of information in these applications. Here's what we did on water. For a pilot, they asked us to put in a pilot about 250 houses, low-flow water meters. And you can see in the middle there, those bars are the daily consumptions for water going back about a year. This one is called Water Miser. Normally there would be an account number or a customer name up there. You can see that this particular customer has shown a 27.4% increase in water consumption this month for some reason. And this is out of a sample of 250. This is number 131. So this particular customer is not doing terribly well. One of the things we were interested in here is we know that we can change consumer behavior through prices, right? This is what industry does all the time. But our research organization was interested in, are there other ways that you can change behavior? And as it suggests here, through social signals. So this is an experiment in social norming in which we gathered different houses together in groups. So houses that have a similar size, a similar number of occupants, and might be expected reasonably to have similar water consumption. And we essentially make competitions or games, if you like, between the members of each of those cohorts. You see also here an indication that because of the kind of meter we installed, we can detect residual, very low-level background flow rates that are typically indicative of either a leak in a pipe or a tap that's been left running. And given that we are now doing much more accurate billing, we can now notify the customer that there is a sort of residual cost running as a result of that leak, and perhaps the customer might want to fix that. So these are a couple. We've done a similar thing for energy in Dubuque as well. So the outcome of this really originated in this common vision that the community was able to develop through a great deal of interaction. This was, because it's a small town, it's possible to do a great deal of face-to-face interaction, which is much harder in a city the size of Christchurch, I appreciate. Engaging a lot of third-party organizations. IBM was one, but there are many, many others that have taken part in here. They were really hungry as well. The reason that we took an interest here was we were looking to establish a global delivery center that would create about 1,500 jobs at a time when unemployment was running in the double digits. And they were really hungry. Other cities were very helpful and interested, but Dubuque was hungry, and they ended up winning that. So here's a city then that sustained a major disaster, an economic disaster, but showed that if you come together around a common vision, you can actually rebuild your way back from that. So it is now a very highly esteemed city, becoming famous as a go-to place now for particularly relatively young families. Very good place to bring up a family, very good quality of life. I'll leave that thought with you. So the last section I'll cover here is about some interesting methods I've seen recently on forms of collaboration. This is an example, has nothing directly to do with IBM, but it's an example I came across in Oregon back in January. This is a photograph looking down on a large table, maybe 2 meters square, covered with a map of the city of Damascus, Oregon. And in a room full of about 100 such tables, and around each table are about 8 people across, again, the entire demographic spectrum of the city. And the topic of this exercise, this charrette, was, should the city create a waste recycling center? Now, I'm sure you must have been through similar exercises. This is not necessarily the most popular thing to have in your neighborhood. And therefore is a contention. And the technique here is to not have an argument among differing perspectives on where this thing should be put, but to start that discussion from what are the values that we have, and how do we describe those values? What words do we use? As an example, it's not relevant to Damascus, but an example from Utah. In Utah is a relatively conservative state in the United States. It would be inappropriate in an exercise of this kind to use the word environment in Utah. Environment means something that's been fenced off and people aren't allowed to go there. But what you can talk about is nature. Now, nature is a good word. It actually means the same thing, but it has a very different emotional response from the community. And so people have discovered that you really need to get these debates going from the level of what are the values of the community. And what the flow is about, what all these lines are about, is how would such a facility fit into the flow of life in this community? How would it relate to energy consumption? How would it relate to water consumption? How would it relate to access to other facilities in the space? And one of the things that I'm very interested in looking at is, can we do an electronic version of this that would enable many, many more people to take part in this? Another major movement that I've come across in the last couple of years is open data, and I heard some information this morning that makes me very encouraged about Christchurch from this point of view. 10 years or so back, 12 years maybe, governments started to publish on their websites documents, typically reports from very boring committee meetings. And then 4 or 5 years ago, they started to publish operational reports. So here's the monthly operational report from the Transportation Agency, the on-time performance of the buses, for example. And then just in the last couple of years, cities start to publish real-time operational data, like, going back to the earlier example, where are the buses? Or this winter, in the context of Chicago, where are the snowplows? Because if you know where the snowplows are, you might be able to work out how you can drive through a city that's just had a snowstorm. And that there is an organization that's come up with a set of principles for that data. They have to be accessible to anybody, whether actually in the community or not, but generally accessible to everyone. They must be timely. The closer you can get them to real time, the more valuable they become. They should be machine processable, and what that really means, they shouldn't be photocopies of documents, right? We're looking for real bits. They need to be complete so that you can build complete models, complete understanding of these. They need to be primary. They should not be condensed and abstracted. We actually need to know where all the buses are and not just in aggregate where the buses are. So it's a great, and lastly, it should be non-discriminatory. Right? All groups should have the right of access to these things. So these are, this flow of data is causing quite a revolution in the number of cities around the world, and I gather it may be beginning to take root here as well. Communities are springing up, hacker communities, software development communities around these. In the Chicago example, the city decided to publish real-time, more or less real-time information on where are the snowplows. But a hacker community looked at that and said, well, yeah, that's interesting. But what's even more interesting is where have the snowplows been, because that's where the snow has been cleared. And we can work that out by looking over time where they've been. And now you can start to provide a service with an app that enables someone to say, I need to go from this street to that street, and be able to come back and say, well, this is the route that you can take where the snow has been cleared. So you start to see these communities, that's a relatively trivial example, beginning to develop much more complex systems of this kind. We see organizations setting up civic commons, open plans, Code for America. Code for America is quite a large organization. Essentially runs competitions. Cities can submit proposals for apps that they would like to have developed, and Code for America can then marshal some of its members to come and converge on that city for a day, for a weekend, run a hackathon, build that app, maybe build other apps as well. And as it says down at the bottom, maybe you'll have a competition among those developers as well. So this is starting a new kind of economy built around information that's collected by the city that has value to its citizens. And it generates then these small but perhaps very innovative communities of software developers. I think that's something, as I say, earlier on today, I got a signal that maybe things like that are beginning to happen here too. So closing off, I guess after any kind of disaster, one of the first thoughts that people have is, where are we going to get the money to pay for rebuilding all of this stuff? And I have myself stood in the middle of a debris-strewn landscape and thought, how in God's name are we ever going to rebuild this? But for me, the rebuild is not necessarily on the infrastructure, or not primarily on the infrastructure. It's how are we going to rebuild this community, the lives of the people who used to live here. So money, yes, is necessary. And I think in your case, through the EQC, you have some very good sources to do that, where you could find out much more information about some of the solution areas that I've talked about here. You'll see on this slide, in reality, Smarter Cities extends into areas I didn't cover, like healthcare and education as well. And so I will finish at that point, and thank you all for your attention.